Okay, so next up, I'm going to look at Socrates and Phaedrus. Socrates and Phaedrus, Socrates is discussing the way that people will trick you with language, they will trick you with words. And his main example, he's going to give some examples. Now, he talks in a very abstract way at the bottom of page 15, but it's a little bit confusing. But he says basically the easiest way to confuse people is when there's a very tiny difference between two things. Then you can trick them. So, for example, in our class, we talked about, right, like we talked about, is an Oreo cookie a sandwich? Is cereal soup? Is a burrito a sandwich? Is a taco a sandwich? Is a hamburger a sandwich? Is a hot dog a sandwich? Because there's a small difference between these things. It's a very micro difference, right? The difference between a hot dog and a hamburger, right, is just like there's just meat, there's bread, there's some kind of protein, and there's bread. But then there's just, if they touch, it's a hot dog, and if it breaks apart, it becomes a sandwich. But if it's here, it's a hot dog. And so there's very tiny differences. Another famous example of the way a good way to sort of confuse people and trick them um, is this is a sort of a weird philosophical question. I'm going to give you now, but I like it a lot. How many grains of sand does it take to make a heap, a pile? The problem with that, think about it like this: if let's say you have coffee, a cup of coffee, and someone says, "Do you want sugar in it?" Right? And you may like sugar in your coffee, and you might not like sugar in your coffee. But here's the thing: you probably don't care at all between a coffee with no sugar or a coffee with a single grain of sugar. What's the difference? You're not going to taste that. Okay. So then you probably also don't care about the difference between coffee that has 1 grain of sugar and coffee that has two. I'm not talking grain, the little sand-like pieces, the one tiny little piece taken out of a tweezer. So you don't really care about the difference between a cup of coffee with 0 sugar or a cup of coffee with one little tiny piece of sugar. No difference. You don't care. You probably also don't care about coffee that has one little piece of sugar versus coffee with 2 little pieces of sugar. What's the difference? Right? You're not going to taste the difference between one tiny little piece of sugar and one other 2 tiny little pieces of sugar, so you don't care. Either one's fine. You don't care. Okay, do you care about the difference between a cup of coffee that has 2 tiny pieces of sugar or 3? You don't care. 3 or 4, you don't care. 4 or 5, you don't care. 5 or 6, you don't care. 6 or 7, you don't care. And you go all the way up to 1,000, a million. At what point does it become too much sugar? Because you didn't, and each little decision felt like it didn't matter. But the difference between where you started and where you ended up matters a great deal. If you're a fan of a TV show like Breaking Bad, it's worth pointing out that each individual decision the guy on Breaking Bad makes sense. I understand why he made this illegal decision, this tiny illegal decision, this tiny immoral. He does these little immoral or unethical things, and they're small, but they add up. So that across the whole course of 5 seasons, he goes from being a nice high school professor to being an evil drug lord. And it's not like, obviously there's a big difference between being a nice high school professor and an evil drug lord. But each individual decision in the middle there was small. And so it's those small things where people can really trick you. And so Socrates starts talking about that a little bit here at the bottom of this page. He says the art of disputation, then, meaning that's debating with words, is not confined to the courts and the assembly, but is one and the very same in every use of language, right? This is what language does. It's to convince people to do things and to think things. And this is the art, if there be such an art, which is able to find a likeness of everything to which a likeness can be found, and draws into the light of day the likeness and disguises which are used by others. How do you mean? Well, let me put the matter thus. When will there be more chance of deception? When the difference is large or small? Well, when the difference is small, right? Again, you're not going to notice the difference between 1 grain of sugar in your coffee and 2 grains, right? You can really trick somebody like that because if it's a tiny thing, they're not going to notice. He says, the difference is small, and you will be less likely to be discovered in passing by degrees into the other extreme than when you go all at once. Of course, right? So if you just slip one tiny little grain of sugar into a person's coffee, and you put, a little bit of tiniest little bit in someone's coffee, and then you increase it every day, you're not going to notice. Whereas if you dump a bag of sugar into a cup of coffee, people are going to notice that immediately, right? But if you just put like one more grain in their coffee every day, they won't notice. Of course. Well, he then who would deceive others and not be deceived must exactly know the real likenesses and differences of things. He must. And if he is ignorant of the true nature of any subject, how can he detect the greater or lesser degree of likeness in other things to that of which the hypothesis he is ignorant? He cannot. So he says you have to be knowledgeable. You have to know what's going on. You have to have the truth. Otherwise, people will trick you. You have to know good from bad every step of the way. That way you don't end up making 100 sort of bad decisions that are very, very small that add up after a while. You can think about this with money, right? Right, you don't care very much about a penny. And the difference between 1 penny and 0 pennies is very small. The difference between 2 pennies and 1 penny is very small. But if you get enough pennies, it starts to feel like actual money you can use to buy shit, even though they're very small things. So he says you have to really know these differences, and you have to be able to think about them like that. So just because you need knowledge, so in our coffee example, what Socrates would say is, you better really know what you're drinking. You better be able to taste every little grain of sugar, or somebody's going to put too much sugar in your coffee and you're not going to notice. You better know good from evil and think about that for each individual decision, because otherwise you're going to become a bad person before you even realize it. So Socrates then says, now I've changed pages on the top of 16. So Socrates says, and when men are deceived and their notions are at variance with realities, meaning when they believe in illusions, it is clear that error slips in through resemblances. Yes, that is the way, right? Those little tricky things, mistakes come in. Then he who would be a master of the art must understand the real nature of everything. That is one of the most important things. The art here that is speaking, writing, discourse. He says, then he who would be a master of the art must understand the real nature of everything, or he will never know either how to make the gradual departure from truth into the opposite of truth, which is affected by the help of resemblances, or how to avoid it. So this is Socrates' big point, which is that if you want to be a writer, you think writing, speech class, this class is composition, you have speech class, you think classes like speech and composition are just about how to put words together smartly. It's about organization and grammar and spelling and punctuation. It's about, formatting your papers to be typed double spaced with a header at the top and page numbers in the bottom and MLA citation and blah, blah, blah. And he says, no, it's so much bigger than that. You have to understand the nature of big ideas in the universe. You have to understand big things. Otherwise, your writing doesn't matter. If it's coming from a place of ignorance. And that every writer, every speech maker, and by the way, every person, because all people use words. He says everybody needs to know truth from falsehood. You need to be able to know, to tell an error from the truth, and you have to know it. So he enlarges it. People think speaking, and people think again, as Phaedrus was saying, aren't speeches just something you do in court? And he says, no. Speeches, using words is something everybody does every day. You use words. And that people that use words need to know about big philosophy issues. They need to know about truth. And that's every person on Earth. One of the things that makes humans different from animals is the incredibly complex language that we have, and the written language in particular, which we'll talk more about later. Because animals have ways of communicating with other animals, certainly. I mean, certainly animals can kind of signal each other. But what they definitely don't have is the ability to keep their words written down so that an animal 100 years later can read it. They don't have that. And that's a crucial, that's really, so one of the things that defines what a human being is, it's an animal that uses language and words at this point. The birds are really going nuts. Oh, look at all the birds. Oh, these little guys down there, they're doing, wait, wrong way. Oh, yeah, I guess you can't see them, they flew away. But they're doing bird shit. All right. So this is what Socrates does, is he enlarges the entire conversation, so that being a writer, human beings speak, but in order to use words correctly, you better anchor them to truth, which means every person should be a philosopher. And that is the real reason why we make you take all these classes in college, even though you just want to major in respiratory therapy or accounting, or you want to be a nurse. If you're a human being and use language, then you should know stuff about all kinds of things, which is why we force you to take a poetry class, and it's why we force you to take a philosophy class, and it's why we force you to take mathematics, and it's why we force you to take anthropology and history and all these kinds of things, because you use words, and we want you to be knowledgeable when you use them. So use them the right way, like Socrates wants, and not the wrong way. The wrong way is rhetoric and the sophists. Car salesman.